All right. Hello, people, or later viewers, given the fact that we have zero viewers right now. This is a hangout where Paulie and I both were on the same page, where we both wanted to clarify these things because at this point, it seems apparent to me, and I'll ask Paulie in a second, that Derezzed 83, when it comes to philosophy of mind, he's either being intentionally obtuse or he just really does not understand what he's talking about. Paulie, what do you think?
Well, I mean, he wants to. We were just talking about this. He wants to sort of impress you with the medical background that he has, and sort of dodge the argument. So it's pseudo intellectual dick measuring, and it's uh, it's this idea of the more you can sort of impress your opponent with your background, the more the less of the more of an effort he or she will have in trying to destroy your argument. So it's this idea of trying to impress anyone who disagrees with you with your credentials. Which, I mean, credentials aren't bad, but if your argument is bad to begin with, then no amount of credentials will sort of make up for that. If you're wrong, you're wrong.
Well, it's bringing in technical knowledge for the sake of bringing it in. And the big issue, this was the first thing that both of us jumped on, is the fact that he didn't reading that was required for just even an entrance into this con. It seems pretty, and this segues right into our first topic that we had laid out, which was he doesn't even know what eliminativists actually say about qualia. And to be clear, I think both of us are eliminativists when it qualia. You don't have to be an eliminativist when it comes to everything. For example, consider himself an eliminative materialist, as Gary Edwards pointed out on my video. And the reason for this is because he largely accepts most of their philosophy of mind and most of their metaphysics. He doesn't eliminate everything, and he still holds to some folk psychology being that element of folk psychology is what he calls the intentional stance.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, but he seems to misunderstand what anti-realism is. So that's my biggest sort of beef with him, is that when I say that I'm an anti-realist about qualia, it's not only about denying the existence of something. That can be an anti-realist position, but it's also a position of I don't know what the hell you're talking about, and I don't think that what you're talking about is remotely coherent. So until you can give me something meaningful, I don't think it makes any sense to even bring up this concept. So that's in that sense, I'm an anti-realist about qualia, because as has been demonstrated, he cannot define the term in such a way that there is any sort of thing that you can latch onto. It always falls through your hands like jello.
Yeah, that is precisely what the issue is. So when he goes, Dennett denies that we need any eliminate qualia, um, denies that qualia, that's a mischaracterization. That, that's like ask how many times have you beaten your wife? It's a leading type of description because Derezzed thinks that eliminativists and don't believe in subjective experience, and he's admitted. He said that this is the strange thing about him. Oh, you man, and then out of nowhere, he'll just say, well, that is what I believe, and I think that he just doesn't understand that what Dennett believes. Um, to said, and if you look on my, it's got a red tie, right? So the redness of that tie would be a qual, or a quail, or however you want to pronounce it, right? Quale,
Yeah.
being the singular for qualia. So the quale would be that redness of red.
Yes.
And there is a redness of red. There is this thing that jumps out about it. When you actually look at it, when you actually examine the issue, both scientifically and philosophically, you realize that when you start describing the redness, being something that's so ineffable and so and just so vapid that you're not actually describing a state of affairs. You're just applying, and this is actually what Dennett says, this pseudo philosophical, pseudo scientific label to something that just doesn't need a label. And the comparison that he makes is it's the same way that we don't view, when we talk about something that's living, we don't talk about the elan vital. We don't, right? We accept that things don't have violently process, or at least most of the same people. That's saying.
You're cutting off.
So he doesn't go out of his way to. Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
So how much of that was sensible?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understood it. It was, you're cutting it off a little bit. Yeah, but my major issue with him now is that we've been sort of going back and forth on this idea of givenness, and I'm pointing out to him that blue is not just one thing. It can be given to you to varying degrees. So the blue that is seen by a professional artist is not the same as the blue that is seen by a toddler. And you're conflating the two by just giving them one label, blue, when there are different degrees to which blue can be given depending on your cognitive capacities. So in my 90-minute video, I deconstructed the givenness of qualia into 4 parts based on a philosophy paper that was written quite some time ago that takes into account that qualia isn't just one thing. So those 4 levels are the phenomenological given, which is the least amount of givenness. It's the givenness you get in change blindness experiments where you don't notice the change. So there's a sort of an anti-realist position about whether or not your qualia changed if you didn't notice it. Then you have the factual given, which is givenness of qualia at the level, of behavioral response. So this is the sort of givenness that you would find in most animals, that don't have a sense of self, but they can still react to stimuli in their environment, and they do so at a rate that suggests that they're very good at stimulus detection. Then you have the epistemological given, where you have a sense of I, but you don't have language, but the sense of I allows you to formulate a sort of proto-belief about the quale you're experiencing. And then you have the linguistic given that allows you to articulate the belief that you have about what you know that you're experiencing and responding to. So there are different levels of that, and to treat it all as one thing really muddies the waters.
And I mean, I'd be surprised if he actually watched your video or listened to it. I mean, you can just listen to his video, we can just listen to your video, right? I mean, there's plenty in there that, you don't need the visuals. I don't, and you can listen to it while you're driving or something like that.
It's 90 minutes. And then each case that I gives an example of a sort of disorder, or an example of an adult human being who has that level of givenness as the limit of their sort of sensorial capacities. So for the phenomenological given, I presented a change blindness experiment where some people didn't notice the change. For the factual given, I presented blind sight, where you don't believe you consciously see anything, but yet you're able to navigate stairs and um, detect certain shapes and objects um, without, consciousness. Then I added the epistemological given, where you can't sort of articulate what it is you're seeing, but you know that you're seeing something, but you can't, formulate the words. This was in the case of two women who had aphasia. And then the linguistic given, wherein a woman sees, in this case, it was a fawn for the first time, and she's now able to attach a label to that particular image, to that particular experience. So there are different levels of this, and it's not just one thing. And he treats it as one thing. So I'm going to pull up the picture or a screenshot of the comment he sent me. In your video on D-Search, and here it is. And he says, quote, responding to me, "I have no idea how you think that this is my thesis, well, not my thesis, but my point about conceptual capacities. I have no idea how you think this argues against the existence of the subjective features of qualia, such as the blueness of blue. In fact, you've conceded that subjective experiences are possible without a conceptual framework. The fact that conceptual framing may or may not modify subjective experiences is irrelevant. Substance dualists or property dualists would agree to the statement that one subjective experience, such as propositional attitudes or what you termed conceptual frameworks, could affect another subjective experience, such as qualia." So that's what he said.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things where it just comes off as him just fundamentally not understanding the point you're trying to make, right?
Yeah.
I don't really know what else to say. I mean, he has said on, my big beef is, he just makes these basic mistakes. For example, so one of his arguments was, so one of your main points is that there are levels of givenness.
Yes.
To any given, sensorial experience.
Right.
And so this is the idea that there is a certain level, and I'm just reiterating and explaining to the audience, that, for example, there are things that are just that on some level are biologically given. There are things that are given by different types of experience and different social cues, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things is that you're shaped by your society, right? This is, and you gave the example of the Himba people who can't see blue because their culture has no concept of blue.
They don't need it in their society. It doesn't. So they need a concept of multiple different types of green, but they don't really need a concept of blue because it doesn't serve a purpose in their society. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that was one of your main points, or has been one of your main points. In Derezzed's response video, what he did was he talked about how children can pick up all types of cues, which is a well-known fact. Like, I learned this in introductory psychology. Again, this was me being drunk, and I was already, I think it says something about your level of knowledge on a topic when someone who is admittedly drunk, who has no specialty in psychology, remembers an intro psychology video that obviously refutes your position. And so what children are actually really, really good at, young children, especially pre-linguistic children, is they can pick up cues, right? So this is how they learn how to emotionally socialize themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they understand faces very early so that they know what faces will lead to their survival and benefit. But even more than that, this is why, especially in the region of the country where I live, young kids it's much easier for them to distinguish between languages in meaningful ways, and this is why young kids have an easier time being bilingual. Like, I dated a girl who her parents are from Mexico, and her first language is Spanish, and look, I was an AP student in Spanish. I was pretty much fluent. I speak pretty good Spanish, but her Spanish compared to my Spanish, because of the period at which she was able to discern these sounds, I mean, it's there's no contest. And this is because as a small child, you can differentiate more stimuli.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but he doesn't get this. He's trying to, when we say that the social construct around a person shapes their experience, you can't take someone with no experience who hasn't been shaped by it and say, oh, look, this person hasn't been shaped by it. Well, no shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and when it comes to learning language and being hypersensitive, kids are good at that. But the thing is, they're not conscious of the associations and distinctions that they're making. That's the big point. We've relaxed into our conceptual structure, in this case, the English language, so in such a way that we are more conscious than babies are, even though they can make more distinctions. So the point I made is that it's a cognitive trade-off, because the price they pay for the ability to make more distinctions is that they're less conscious of them. And the price we pay for the consciousness and perceptual vividness that we have as adults is our ability to make as many distinctions as babies do. This is a very well-known fact. So I presented.
This isn't something. And by the way, people, we're not talking about something that isn't well known. I mean,
very well known.
You can find tons of documentaries that talk about this. You can find tons of resources that aren't, this isn't us talking about technical research that we've done. Like I said, this was something I learned in an intro psychology class. And like you said, it's the efficiency of having frameworks versus the ability to discern all things regardless of framework. It's a trade-off.
Yeah, and the same can be applied to music. You could replace the Mary's Room argument with a woman who knows everything about the ear and pressure waves. But the thing is, the question would be, when she comes out of her cell, she hears a middle C for the first time, does she recognize that it's middle C? Well, that already assumes that she would recognize the conceptual framework of that assumes that she would recognize the conceptual framework. And the only way she would have access to that is through her subjects, but her subjects would only refer to it indirectly. And the problem in these sorts of conversations is that they divorce qualia, in this case, the sound of middle C, from any sort of perspective. And they're not giving any sort of past context that might influence how someone hears that particular vibration. So if you're trained in the Western system, of course, you're going to hear it relatively the same. But if you're an advanced music student trained in an African system of music or an Indonesian or Japanese system of music, then you're going to hear that a lot differently. So.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I'm appalled by is that it just kind of seems, like the thing that bothers me about this issue is that, like, look, your videos go into great depth, so I could understand maybe him not following it, right? Like, that's understandable. Like, they're not easy videos necessarily to follow, and that's not your fault.
I try to make
it's a hard topic.
Yeah.
Like, even though I think you make it extremely clear, right?
Yeah.
I could imagine a scenario where someone has difficulty understanding it, because also I discuss these issues a lot with you and you bounce ideas off of me. So to be fair, I'm in a decently privileged position, regarding that. But when you make repeated errors and then you refuse to acknowledge those errors, and you have a stance that just never changes when it comes to criticism, I mean, you can only come to one conclusion here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean, I've made the point repeatedly on this particular issue, I went into depth explaining basically the point is that you can't. There's no qualia without context. I don't see that. I don't think that's a really hard, profound thesis to make, and I don't think that's a really hard concept to understand. You have to have a sort of context, um, and a lot of times people just talk about these things like they're in a vacuum, and without context, there's no way you can actually understand what people are talking about. There's a conceptual context that comes with every single sensation has to be mediated through some conceptual context. There's a reason that I don't hear Chinese the way a Chinese speaker who's fluent hears the same thing. It's because the conceptual capacities that I have don't allow me to understand the words he's saying or she's saying in the way that a fluent Chinese speaker would. This is basically cognitive penetration, which is that the conceptual framework impacts the way in which the sensory manifold is experienced. This is not a hard thesis. It really isn't.
And also, it's not. It's also not a thesis that even qualia realists, which are a large portion. Those people don't deny this, right? They might have a different account of it. Never heard someone outright deny it, even if they are skeptical about. Yeah.
No, you cut off for a second.
Oh, sorry. Again, what I would say is that you don't hear people denying this fact, even if they accept qualia as a thesis.
But their conversations sort of carry that assumption. So the point of my long video was to sort of take a step back from a lot of the assumptions that people make and just look at it with a fresh set of eyes. And that's helpful because then you can pause someone and say, wait a minute, what is the context of the middle seed that you're talking about? So
right. I mean, what I'm pointing out is that the fact that he is just so adamant about this lack of cognitive penetration it's just embarrassing even for his stance, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous. Doesn't he speak two languages? I mean, he should know this better. If you speak more than one language, you should know this better than anybody else. It's not.
I mean, I don't know Hungarian, but I know that in Spanish and I speak a little bit of Yiddish and Hebrew. There are words. There's a swear word in Hebrew. It's kusemek, and it means your mother's vagina. Like, the vividness of that swear just does not exist. Like, you can translate it, but it does not exist in the English language. The phrase, the idea of chutzpah in Yiddish,
yeah.
like, the only reason we have a concept of that is because we've appropriated so much Jewish culture.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. But I'm not immersed in that culture, so it's not going to be as given to me as it would be to someone who's immersed in that culture. So he's trying to take these sort of culturally constructed concepts and apply them universally. And that's the problem. You can't do that. Because you're just giving labels to certain things, but there's nothing really intrinsically grounded in them. So,
and how much of this do you think is a result of just not being, and again, this may not just be him, and I think now I'm speaking more general, it's not being open to the idea that, it's sort of Cromwell's rule to an extent. When Cromwell said before, like, the Holy Church of Scotland, I think it was along the lines of, I beg of you, by the bowels of Christ, consider the fact that you may be wrong, right?
Well, I don't know what goes through his head, because the thing is, he wants to have another conversation with me, but he knows that, I mean, you saw that. I mean, you were there in that exchange. He wasn't giving it I'm going to read from what he wrote to me, but he wasn't giving us a coherent definition. So one of the points I want to pick with him is he said, quote, "In fact, you've conceded that subjective experiences are possible without a conceptual framework," unquote. Now, I don't know what to think of that because I don't remember conceding it that, but I don't even know how he's defining subjective experience. So does a 2-year-old who sees green have a subjective experience of green, even though that 2-year-old doesn't even know what that is? I mean, how does a fox have a subjective experience of blue? I mean, how there's different things that you have to bring to the table.
And short of, entering into their subjectivity, you don't know. And also, we're not, there's also an important point in your stance there, is that these things don't, the nice thing about your stance is that he's all or nothing as to whether these things are actually experienced. Whereas we can say that, okay, like this person, like a 2-year-old who, let's say, is pre-linguistic with respect to colors, right?
Yes.
Like they're not going to have any, even if they know some colors, they're probably not going to know more complex colors. Like, for example, I just bought a printer, so cyan, for example, right?
Yeah.
Like they're not going to have any concept of what that is. Um, you know, but does that mean that, if they're in a sufficiently early point of development, that they can still discern that's a different thing, that they haven't been conditioned to where they don't recognize it?
Well,
You know, again, these types of perceptions come in degrees because they're very context specific with respect to their givenness.
yeah, and they're cognitively accessible to people who've been trained in that system. If you're a professional artist, then how you hear cyan, or not hear but see it, is going to be very different from how a toddler would see it. So I actually, in my long video, I made a graph of the givenness of a C major chord, and um, it ranged from like a pre-linguistic toddler to the composer Witold Lutosławski. He's a famous Polish composer. He's done a lot of work in 12-tone music and exploring different sort of tones. And I think he's written some pieces for tones that are not even on the Western system. But the givenness of a C major chord to him is going to be way different from a college music student or a 5-year-old with language just learning the piano. I mean, I put a graph up on it of it so that to show that it's a matter of scale. And I don't know if that went over his head or not. I don't think he saw it, but it's the problem is he's trying to take these concepts and assume that there's only one level of givenness, and I mean it just doesn't work because if you treat it all like one thing, then you're plugging your understanding of blue into a 2-year-old's perception. It doesn't work like that. You can't do that.
Well, isn't this also the reason? I mean, when I took, again, referencing intro psych, when I took that, God, what was it? Almost 6 years ago at this point. When I took that, you will see these renderings that like say this is what it looks like to a 2-year-old, or like this is what it looks like to a kid that's 6 months old in like the child development section. And like when you see it's actually the same thing with if you see some sort of Planet Earth documentary or something like that. When they render it as this is how the shark sees like the ocean, right?
Yeah.
There's a different concept of it, and the best we can do is sort of abstract based on our framework, but in reality we have to accept that ultimately when we talk about a single person's representation of an external phenomenon, ultimately we have to sort of put our hands in the air and say, we don't have access. We can just try to imagine.
Well, that's what I kept that's a point that kept being reiterated in my video, that you know, even the subject object distinction might not be applicable at the level of the phenomenological given, because um it doesn't, we're plugging in our sort of perceptual framework um where it doesn't apply, and that's, problematic. And then I ended the video, I'm pulling it up right now. Okay, so this is a part from the end. As animals, we have different sense organs with different degrees of sensing, and we act to different environmental stimuli differently. That's despite our amazing ability to communicate between other humans and even other relatively cognizant animals, we must realize that their perceptual concepts are not our perceptual concepts. It wouldn't be fair to allow our sensation terms to take precedent over theirs. They don't apply our perceptual concepts in their experience. So while the squirrel monkeys did see red and green, they did not know in a de dicto sense what it's like to see red and green. And red and green in this sentence were highlighted with their corresponding colors, red and green. I continue. It may be meaningless to say that they know what it's like to see red or what it's like to see green, even though they might apply an approximately equivalent concepts. The point I'm trying to make is that we need to trace our discussion of consciousness back to the way we describe it in the first place.
Yeah, and I would be very skeptical as to whether he paid attention to that point.
Yeah, but I mean, it's an extremely important point, because
that's well, and again, this is the reason why we're making this video, is because for me personally, it's if you he couldn't just admit that he was wrong. Like, look, I understand. You could go, listen, I didn't read that. This was stupid of me. I'll take the video down, or I'll do some clarification. That's fine with me, right? Like, I applaud that behavior. But instead, he just digs his heels in and says, I'm right. And then quotes, and this was the hilarious thing to me, is he quoted, when I was describing Dennett's view on these types of things, you want to know what he did? He quoted Wikipedia.
Saying what exactly? Was it
talking about how he was like, it was just some random passage from a Wikipedia page, maybe on eliminative materialism.
Oh yeah,
when I quoted
now.
Quining qualia. I mean,
yeah,
there's if that does, he's either just a bumbling moron, or he's he's dishonest. Like, he literally has to not be able to function intellectually to do that type of thing.
I'm reading his comments.
In all honesty.
I'm reading his comments on your video. He's bringing up, he's bringing up C fibers and glycine and unmyelinated C fibers, as well as they have lower threshold for sensitization and excitation. This seems to stand from lower levels of inhibitory neurotransmitters. All of this is irrelevant. This is a really abstract, this has been, for the most part, removed from biology, so you don't have to get into all that. We're talking about whether or not it makes sense to talk about qualia without a certain context. And the main idea of all of this.
Well, no, it's why he doesn't like me and why he doesn't like you. And it's because we don't, like, we can just go, well, why are you bringing up this nonsense that does, like, Gary Edwards did the exact same thing, which was like, why are you bringing up this terminology that is either irrelevant in one of his videos, or just plainly wrong? And he does this repeatedly. And I gotta say, being able to use fancy terminology doesn't prove you're smart if you can't use it properly or think about it. Ultimately, it's just a tool. I'm not smart because I can use, if I can use a calculator, right? It's if I know what the calculations actually mean.
Yeah, and the main idea I've been trying to articulate in these last several of my last videos is that qualia is context dependent. And so to talk about qualia divorced from any sort of perspective and talk about a sort of free floating essence of middle C or green is incoherent in my view, which is why I asked him, in a world in which everything, the only thing that you perceived was the wavelength that causes you to label something as green, if that was the only thing you saw, and you saw nothing else, would what you're calling green in that world be the same thing as what you're calling green in this world? Because my point is that your ability to call something green depends on your is reliant on your ability to distinguish it from other colors. You can't divorce the concept of green from your ability to distinguish it from other colors like red, blue, yellow, etc. And he had a hard time with that question. But it's an important one because if you're going to hold to a sort of atomism about qualia, then you're forced to say that those would be the same thing, those would be the same perceptions. But how would they be if they're in two totally different contexts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've pretty much covered. I mean, I've talked about what I wanted to talk about, and that's just that the thing that I find frustrating, and I've said this before, is that I just don't, I don't honestly think, that I think it's just very blatant that this is a person who like wants to be taken seriously, but yet won't do the hard work to do it. And I'm in one of those, as people who associate with me on YouTube know, I'm in one of those cycles where I'm sort of in a mood about, dealing with idiocy. And I don't think that, see, here's the thing, is I don't think that Derezzed is necessarily an idiot in all points of his life. It's just on this issue, he's just, he's just acting like a moron.
Yeah.
And I've said what I want to say at this point. I don't know if you want any closing words.
Oh yeah. Well, one problem for him that I haven't brought up is simply the whole qualia inversion. Just how does he know that the red he sees today is the same thing as the red he saw yesterday, and his memory hasn't been inverted? Because Ned Block, in a presentation he gave about using particularly about qualia inversion in regards to Wittgenstein's private language argument, is who says, I mean, the question that should be asked to him is, who says you're the one for whom red things look red and green things look green? Because in order to talk about red, you have to sort of deploy that concept in a way that points to something that's necessarily objective. You can't just point inward at yourself and, automatically decide for everyone else that you're the arbiter of what red is. But since qualia is subjective, and he believes in qualia as this rigid thing, that's what he has to do, which sort of destroys his position. So I don't know his response to that.